Okay, so this video is pretty much nothing of consequence and is certainly nothing that would ever happen in the lore, but I started thinking about the topic and I just couldn't stop. So while working on complaining about the end times, here's a little snacky video I came up with. So to make a short explanation about something everybody already knows about, the Chaos Gods feed on the emotions and prayer of mortal beings. It's the same for both 40k, Fantasy, Age of Sigmar, and hell, probably Blood Bowl too. The rage for Khorne just comes from watching your favorite quarterback get his shit pushed in by a dwarf on a steamroller in that last case. These things make them powerful and more to the point, makes them what they are. I mean, if suddenly everyone praising and worshipping Khorne only ever went to war in the name of protecting the weak and innocent, instead of things like wanton, bloodlust, and compensating for a micro-penis, he'd probably go through some pretty significant changes. So this got me thinking, what if we took the Chaos Gods and shut them in a big box? Never said I was thinking about anything intelligent, did I? But to elaborate, what would happen to them if you took the Chaos Gods and essentially locked them away from the thing they thrive on the most? Say, force Nurgle into an environment where he can't spread plagues, or put Khorne in a massive garden that's completely indestructible or something like that. You could just dump Slaanesh in a big ol' sensory deprivation tank, and Tzeentch gets sent to, I don't know, the Nuremberg trials with a lie detector or something. Somewhere he can't do magic and lie. Or just lock him up in a version of the box Magnus got locked to in TTS, only scaled up for a god and not the embodiment of the phrase "so smart you're stupid." Would anything like this ever happen? Not a chance in hell. And it would be stupid if it did. But I thought this might be an entertaining enough thought experiment for a video, so here we are. To make clear what I mean by all this as best as I can, in this completely nonsensical scenario, the Chaos Gods aren't going to be reduced in strength or crippled in any way. Essentially in this scenario, I'm taking them as they are and then removing them from any way to gather more power. No schemes, no worshippers, no nothing. They won't get access to the largely negative emotions that make them up. The whole idea is what would happen to the gods if you lock them away from their source of emotions they usually thrive on and how that might affect them. If you really need something, just imagine the Emperor or Sigmar threw them in a jail cell and won't open the door until they're dead or turned into something worth letting out, essentially. So with those ground rules set, let's go. Let's start with Slaanesh, because I play Eldar on the tabletop and High Elves in Total War and I want the horny bastard to suffer for it. Something kind of like this did happen with Age of Sigmar, but not to the extent I want here. Slaanesh's followers can still clearly sense her and search for her, they just can't find her and she can't break out on her own power yet. Here it's total isolation, no breakout attempts for her or the other Chaos Gods, no drooling demons into existence or anything like that. What would happen? Well, at first, I imagine Slaanesh would think of it as a new experience and try to make the most of it before realizing quickly that, hey, I can't feel anything. And Slaanesh would also realize that, hey, I can't absorb power or feelings from my followers or demons. Quite frankly, in this scenario, I think Slaanesh would just end up fading into nothing. Unlike the other three, Slaanesh as a Chaos God is almost entirely negative in her portfolio. Fun times feed her, sure, and everyone's down to party at some point or another, but the thing is, Slaanesh feeds on the excess of things, not just when you sit down for tea time in a book or go out drinking. Even most things that are done solely for pleasure like drugs don't give her much. If you roll up a joint and spend the night watching YouTube videos absolutely zoinked out of your mind, you aren't feeding Slaanesh. You can't just do drugs, you need to snort up the ground up remnants of your grandfather's ashes mixed with the purest cocaine and orphan blood. You can't just have an orgy, you need to have an orgy that has a mortality rate higher than the amount of people involved in it. This is doubly true for her 40k incarnation. She was born out of the Eldari race almost as a whole, deciding that simply vibing for all of eternity wasn't enough. The galaxy needed the largest vibe check imaginable. There's really just not much room for good thoughts whenever Slaanesh is concerned. Meanwhile, Tzeentch can in some ways be considered the god of hope, Khorne, for all I hate him, is at least somewhat honorable, and Nurgle loves his followers and demons. In this scenario, I think Slaanesh would eventually just fade away. Her power comes almost entirely from excess, and without a constant source of emotion stemming from it, Slaanesh would eventually lose power and cease to be. There's not enough positive aspects of her to latch onto in this scenario. That's what happens when you min-max too much into orgies and heroin, I guess. Fellow elf simps around the world, rejoice! We found the solution to stopping Slaanesh from voring our souls. All you gotta do is lock a nigh incomprehensible powerful god into something that is almost certainly impossible to build. Pardon, I read that wrong. Is certainly impossible to build. Next up, because I think this is ironically another simple outcome, Tzeentch. Tzeentch worship, unlike Slaanesh, can come from positive things, and funnily enough, many of the people who come to worship the closest thing Warhammer has to an H.P. Lovecraft god do it in the name of a positive outcome. You might pray to the god of scheming and magic so you can be smart enough to overcome the 1984 style government you live in. It's just that along the way you find out that you quite like being able to throw fireballs around like a D&D wizard hitting level 5, let's not be coy about it, we all do it. And it just so happens that once you get rid of the tyrants in charge, you might decide that with all your magical power and newfound wisdom, who else should be in charge but you. Next thing you know, not only do your allies have more tentacles on their face than they do hair follicles, your new favorite hobby has now become building Rube Goldberg machines out of people's still living flayed skin. The point of this horribly contrived hypothetical scenario is that Tzeentch can have inherent good somewhere in his worship, unlike Slaanesh. The problem is, because he and his aspects are so goddamn intertwined with overcomplicated schemes and magic, if he can't do anything with those aspects, he's going to blue screen of death. He can try to scheme his way out of this hypothetical, impossible prison all he wants, but if he can't get out, can't influence the world around him in contrived ways, and can't cast fireballs in a way that doesn't just pass the time or something, then not only are those aspects unfulfilled, but so is one of his other major ones as the god of ambition. He would melt away even as he sits there and stagnates in his timeout box. But he might not totally disappear, as I think Slaanesh would. He could latch onto his aspects of ambition and change in a more positive light. Focus on those who use his power for good, or at least those who start using it for good. At one point in the history of the Warhammer worlds, he was the strongest chaos god by far, at least in fantasy. Then the other chaos gods got together and smashed him to bits like the Hulk playing whack-a-mole. Given that he's the ultimate user of magic ever, maybe he could shred himself into various pieces, each representative of one of his aspects. That way there would still be a bunch of Tzeentches, just none recognizable as what we know as Tzeentch. In this weird scenario I've come up with, maybe the ones that embody things like hope and fighting for a better existence could come out on top. And as Tzeentch exits the hyperbolic timeout chamber, he comes out a better man, person, thing, snake, bird, whatever. Or maybe he'd stroke out for not being able to contrive the demise of random people 10,000 years in the future and die. Who knows with this guy? Next up, Nurgle. Nurgle's a happy guy and pretty easygoing. Lock him up in a cage and ironically that might make him stronger since stagnancy is a part of his portfolio as a god, along with being fat and gross. But lucky for us, I'm the one creating the video and not him, so I don't have to give a concrete explanation for how this would happen. Morathi claps her ass cheeks and Nurgle suddenly can't spread plague anywhere. There's your explanation for how he's cut off from his worshippers and forced to wither away. The point is that however it happens, what'll happen to Nurgle when it does? I think there's a lot of things that can end up happening to good old Nurgle here. One, he might just fade away and die as a result of not having access to a steady stream of power and corruption. That's boring, though. And none of the armies they play are particularly biased against Nurgle. I guess there's the whole Isha thing, but I'm not biased against Nurgle. So a more fun option is that he might transform into something completely unrecognizable. He is to some extent a god of nature and family. Maybe if you lock him away from his literally sick, nasty followers, he would turn into basically a male version of Isha, the elf-dar god of life, nature, and family. Imagine it. Nurgle gets shoved in a hole for a few billion years or however long it takes. It's the warp. Could be 5 minutes real time for all we know. Maybe he comes out and he's still a god of sickness, but in a good way. He might turn into a god of overcoming sickness, if you catch my drift. You still get sick, but Nurgle gives you the antibodies to overcome the disease. Maybe this could coexist alongside family, love, and all that crap. He could turn into a god of all of these things, or maybe just one or two. He might not even have to shatter himself like Tzeentch did, just slowly change over time. Of course, he might also just stay completely the same, in which case I think there's two outcomes here. Either he wallows in nothingness forever, stagnating endlessly and is never let out of his little prison box, or maybe he could stay as a god of stagnancy, but in a more positive light. Some of his followers already seek to end life because they believe Nurgle's part of the universe is to cleanse it so it can start anew, unblemished by the flaws it developed. Perhaps he could solely embrace this aspect of himself as he fully commits to the role of ending that which has long since passed its expiration date. On the surface, this sounds similar to what he already is, but in practice, it might just mean he won't be spreading disease every time someone forgets to wash their hands like the disgusting blob that he is. Christian Macklin. Anyway, moving on. And now the last Chaos God, Khorne. What I have in store for him will be surprising for those of you who are regular viewers of mine, because you will know that I hate him. So you might be expecting me to say, and he dies because he can't smash things, and good riddance to him. But believe it or not, I have more for the Khorne man here today. In fact, honestly, out of all the Chaos Gods, I think Khorne has the best fate possible in this situation. Let me take you through my thought process, foolish and silly as it may be. People generally fight for a reason. Now those in service to Khorne eventually lose sight of that reason in favor of doing things like steroid use, smashing people that can count past 5 in the head with a big hammer, and watching Madagascar in their Hummer so that they emerge without looking on the highway. But until they get to that point of Khorne worship, even the most smooth brain of his followers like Angron fight for a reason, be it to free themselves from tyrants, or to defend their family, or fight in the name of something greater than them. Those who worship Khorne really have the starting point of skulls for the Skull Throne! Don't get me wrong, it does happen, but that's usually the end point of worshipping the guy. In fact, I honestly think that even more so than Nurgle, Khorne worship doesn't stem from evil. It doesn't necessarily come from being a good person, not even close, just not always being a massive dickhead. So with that in mind, what would happen to Khorne if you locked him away from his worshippers and his power base? Well, first he'd scream. A lot. And then he'd try and hit something really, really hard. But when that doesn't work, he'll probably still scream and try to hit things. But as he loses access to more and more of the negative emotions that 90% of his brainless, moronic charismatic followers provide him with, I think he'd go through the most significant changes out of all of the Chaos Gods. He undoubtedly wouldn't stop being a god of war, but he might not just be a god of aimless slaughter in this case. He could turn into a god of actually protecting the weak and helpless. That's not a stretch either, or at least no more than this entire video is stretching. In actual lore, Khorne disapproves of those who seek out weak opponents. Burning down the local dog shelter probably isn't going to yield any worthy battles after all. When kept away from the negative emotions that largely feed him now, however, it's not too much of a leap in logic to assume that he could turn into a sort of crusader god, but like an idealized heroic crusader, not the Imperium's burn down your stuff for being different kind of crusade, you know? A sort of paladin deity for all that's valorous and noble in the Warhammer settings. Instead of skulls for the skull throne, you could collect shields for the shield wall. Oh yeah, that definitely needs some workshopping, but hopefully you get my point. Now tell me, person who was kind and or dumb enough to stick around to the end of the video, have you any ideas of your own for this thought experiment of mine? Because honestly, there's no one real answer to this scenario in this video. I just had an idea I thought was cool and wanted to put it into solid words for other people to hear. Do you agree? Am I a fool? Both, perhaps? Let me know. I'm not asking. Go to the comments now and tell me. Thank you, as always, to my wonderful channel members. You are the horrid and evil emotions to my status as a Chaos God, letting me exist as I do now for generations to come. If you'd like to support the channel, feel free to become a member or subscribe. But even if you don't, thank you for watching and take care out there.
Vengeance, grudge and strife, we march into the afterlife. Wrath and vengeance.